Hello, class. Welcome to chapter number 5, which talks about the Roman world. So let's get started. I'm a little biased because I studied abroad in Italy a while back. I got an opportunity to study abroad, and if you can see me, I'm right there, sort of in the front. And it's been a while since since that study abroad experience. So I'm going to show a couple of pictures of my time there. Ever since after that trip, I was able to go back several times, but the pictures I'm going to show was from that initial trip. So if you see me now versus then, I do look very different. So that's just something to. But I'm a little biased because during that time it was a great experience. I really enjoyed Italy. It's probably one of the cities that I would definitely live in, and really, I fell in love with architecture even more throughout that experience. So hopefully, through this study, we're able to see a bit more of that Roman architecture, and hopefully you enjoy it yourself. And you haven't visited, hopefully you can visit soon. And now with this new knowledge of architectural history, you can maybe create a little tour with your friends or family, whoever you go with. Or if you don't go with anyone, you can still create a tour there. There's always people wanting to hear the history. So let's start with first. Let's go back to the little bit of history, going into the Etruscan people. The Etruscan people, they lived in this area, in the area of what is now called Tuscany, and they were really influenced a lot of the architecture that we're eventually going to see. They really influenced a lot of the Romans, and the Romans really absorbed a lot of the Etruscan ideas. And so one of the things here we can start seeing is this Etruscan temple right here. And sadly, not many remain, or maybe none really remain. But we start seeing some of the, later on I'll talk about it, Vitruvius here, mentioned here. He goes on this, he's the one that records all of these images and all of these plans and drawings, and through Vitruvius we get what is the oldest architecture book, and he starts drawing what the Etruscans had done, and you start seeing something very similar that to the Greeks. You start seeing a cella, which it's inside, and it's here you can't really see it, but it's raised. So both of them are raised. They have what we call a porch, and the colonnade. And so, but the big difference now is that the cella is really closed. You can see that it's really being closed out, and the columns are sort of freestanding. And so while before, you could see this sort of axis, and it was a bit more open and more secluded. Now there sort of seems like you have like two main parts throughout the design, when here you sort of you feel you can walk around this whole thing. So one of the big differences is that these buildings, the Greek buildings, were really meant to be seen from sides. As you're walking up, you sort of see it. So basically, almost any side, you get this amazing view. But the Etruscans, what they really focus on is what is called this frontal face. So this main facade that was really sort of the main image, or the image that they really wanted to focus on. And there is a lot of focus or ornament around the building, but what they really focused was this idea of the face. So when we compare this Greek temple, you note that the colonnades extend only across the front to create a sort of portico, while the cella has been expanded to several chambers set the full width of the temple. And this is a very sculptured building, which was probably, as we saw, that it was very classical times. And as mentioned, it was viewed at an angle. and now has been transformed into a dominated central axis to be seen only frontally, done um, um, by the Etruscans. So it's something that you sort of start seeing. And another thing the Etruscans did was the Tuscan order, which is another order of columns that we've already seen, the Ionic, the Doric, and the Corinthian, but now the Etruscans are introducing us to a new one, and I'll explain a little bit more on that here. And so we have what we've studied, which is the Doric, the Ionic, and the Corinthian, which is, the Doric a bit more masculine, the Ionic more feminine with its volutes, and the Corinthian, this sort of, more organic, this sort of plant based. But the Tuscan is very, very, very similar to the Doric. As you can see, it looks very, very similar, wide base. It starts becoming slimmer. The difference, it does have a base, so it kind of combines a bit of the Ionic. But one of the biggest differences, it doesn't have these flutes. It doesn't have these, what we call this cuts in the column, and it's also a bit shorter. You also see that it usually when they're done, they don't go very long spans. The composite, you really can't see it here, but it's a combination of volutes and it's a combination of the Corinthian, which were these leaves and this organic shapes. So then they start combining this, but again, it's a bit more slender. So these usually did go a bit higher. So these are usually they call the 5 classical orders, or sometimes this is just called the classical orders, and this is called the minor orders. So either or, they're kind of and interchangeable. So there's something to kind of look into. But now remember these 2 orders that are now being added. I know that maybe it was hard enough to learn these 3, but hopefully these sort of make sense as you now understand this. So again, just a little bit of history. I mentioned a little bit of Vitruvius already, and Vitruvius, as he really was someone that just was commissioned to sort of to collect and create these books about architecture, which he creates the 10 books of architecture. And Vitruvius, he wasn't a great writer. He wasn't a very, very good at the idea of writing, but he was, he was good at drawing and conveying information. But mostly, it's the oldest book that has survived, the earliest surviving written work of architecture. So it is very, 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 very important. So anytime you talk about architecture, and his book of architecture are going to come up in conversation. And we mentioned before, in his book, it talks about these 3 things, which is Firmitas, Utilitas, and Venustas. And again, we've talked about this before, so hopefully you know it by now. And it's firmness, function, and beauty. And I mentioned that if anyone ever asks you, why is this architecture good? What makes this building a good building? You say, well, it should have these 3. Does it have the firmness, the durability? Does it have the function? And does it have the aesthetic appeal? Is it really something beautiful? So if it sort of falls under these 3 categories, it is considered a good architecture. And Vitruvius, when he started writing in his book, I won't spend too much time on this, but he starts elevating the status of architecture, of architects, and he starts saying that architects should be equipped with the knowledge of many different things, of all the different arts put together, sort of having this architect is when the word architect comes also from the word master builder. So this idea that he has all these different abilities, all these different things, and he's able to bring music and art and nature and engineering and all these things into creating something. And in this book, the 10 books, he starts talking about that architects should be working on building design, city planning, military engineering, the machines, and more, because there's a lot more things, even including something like clocks. So yeah, Vitruvius, he goes through this book, and it's a really interesting book. So we'll come back to this over and over again, because the Romans, as they start building, they have this information, they have this book, which they're using to design, they're using to construct. Vitruvius was able to collect all this information, and now they have this information, so they're sort of basing a lot of it on what Vitruvius has. So a little bit of Roman history. So this is a really great story of Romulus and Remus, which is said to be the founders of Rome. It's this legend that it's a very interesting legend of how there was this twin brothers that were sort of raised with this she wolf, and eventually Romulus kills his brother Remus, and thus gaining more power and eventually becoming the first ruler and establishing what is now Rome. And it's a very, very important theme of this story because it sort of comes up in architecture and art a lot. And even sometimes you see a lot in architecture this combination of black squares with white squares, and it's making allusion to this story of these two brothers and their fight for power. So it's an interesting story and eventually, as mentioned, they start going into this very war time. They start going into this becoming a republic, and emperors start to rise, such as Nero and Augustus, and these people that really start expanding the Roman emperor. And here you see an image it's a woodcut print done of Julius Caesar in one of his triumphant battles as he's returning from just conquering, which I remember it was Gallia. So then the Roman Empire just simply starts expanding and expanding and expanding and growing and conquering all these different territories. And because of that, they start growing massively. And because they start growing, what's really important to understand is that they bring back all of this knowledge. They start bringing back all of this knowledge, all of this information. So that's why they bring things from the Greek, and they bring back things from the Etruscans, and then bring back things from all of these places that they're traveling to, and they're gathering all of this information, and they're sort of using it and synthesizing it to creating something new. So the Romans take a lot of information, a lot of aspects from all these different places that they conquered, but at the same time they create their own expression of it. So as they start creating territories, as they start expanding their area, they start really building their city. They really start creating their city, and so they start building things like such as aqueducts, which we'll talk about later. But they start building all these things. They start building basilicas. They start building temples. They start building houses. They really build their city. And one of the biggest things, which I'm talking about aqueducts, is they start providing ways of how to really create a civilization that is very functional, bringing water into the city. So I'll talk a little bit about that later on. And talking about the synthesis, I'll talk about it later again, but here in the Colosseum, you see that there's different orders. You see the Corinthian, you see the Ionic, you see the Doric. So there's one building that the Romans are doing, and in one building, they're combining all of these elements at one, and they're not even using them structurally, they're just using them as sort of as ornament type. They're just for decoration. So you start seeing how their battles and as they're expanding, they're bringing back, and they're sort of perfecting or giving them their own signature to all these things that they are really learning or sort of adopting on their travel. And the last thing is the idea of Christianity and how it really becomes a big part of it later on through the Christian era of architecture. We'll see that later on. So it's sort of a little quick Roman history. And so, again, so this is just, I wanted to show you something that's very important to always think about. It's, this is one of the most best preserved temples of antiquity. And Thomas Jefferson, which was, you know, a very important American political person, really enjoyed this. This design and was really influenced by the Romans and their architecture, and you can see how he was inspired. And so I just wanted to show you that how the influence of Roman architecture is still present today. And here, you know, it's not the same type of columns, but you can see the pediments and it's a very, very clear idea of him using those. So let's start with the building techniques and materials. So what made Roman architects really stand out, really take this to a whole new level? And so one of the things that they did was the idea of using arches, which allowed them to really reach long spans. The arch was something that had been used before, and we've seen the arch before. But before, the arch that was used a lot, and we saw it in the Lion's Gate, and we saw it, you know, in the Mycenaean civilization and other designs such as Newgrange and other buildings. But it's this idea of corbelling, and we talked about it. What corbelling was, you can see it here. It's sort of stacking one on one. But with the Romans, they said, let's not do a fake arch, and let's do a true arch. And so a true arch consists of voussoirs, which are these things. You can see each of these, you know, stones sort of cut is called a voussoir. So that's sort of important to know. And they're set in a curved shape, often very like semicircle. And when they're building, it does require a temporary timber formwork or centering to support the voussoirs as they're being laid out until the last voussoir is placed, which is called the keystone. And so the keystone is right here. You can see it labeled here. It was this top the very last stone basically that they place, but the reason it's called the keystone is if that one is removed, the whole thing falls down. So the keystone is extremely important. But there is a price for stability, and that is because the weight of the masonry in these vaulted construction pushes not only downward, as we can see here, it's starting to push downward, but it's also pushing sideways. It's also pushing outward on the support, which is resting. And so this must be, in order for it to be supported, there has to be some sort of dead weight. It has to be required that the piers or the walls be really thick. So that's why usually whenever you see true arch, you're going to see some sort of piers, a sort of wall next to it is usually going to be very thick. So I want you to remember that, because that's going to be, again, something very important. And as we start going through the architecture of Roman, as they're using this arch a lot, but the price that they have to pay is really the thickness of these walls. And so the arch, talking a bit more about the arch, this is, you know, the common shape of the arch, but I want you to think of its multiple versions or its brothers or sisters of the arch, in which this letter B is the vault. And so the arch is basically, I just want you to think of it as multiple arches. You know, just imagine all these sort of individual arches, sort of all, you know, one after the other, and this creates this this Vera vault, this vault. And again, you'll see this in architecture, and through this, these walls are going to be very thick. Another thing that it's another one of these is as these arches are kind of moved on its axis, you start and pushing them together, you get these vaults, what they call the groin vaults. And again, you can start seeing the arches, which is sort of this was a vault and this is a groin vault, is to create these pendatives, this triangular shapes sort of inside of these arches. So again, we'll see those time after time. And just imagine you get an arch, but you flip it on its axis, and now it's upside down. You start getting, and you start this is when you start getting a dome. So you start seeing the shape of a dome. And a dome is, again, just very, very similar to an arch, the very same concept of an arch. And again, whatever is holding, usually the rim has to be very, very strong, because again, the weight is coming down, but it's also coming onward, so outward. And so it's important to take that in consideration as we start seeing these buildings and their use of the dome. On this image on the right is the Temple of Diana, and this is a very good example of Vera vaulted masonry construction used to enclose the space. You can see the roofs of the vaults. You can see here the roofs of the vaults, and the use of the alternating triangular and segmented arch pediments above the blind windows to articulate the walls. So you start seeing these alternating triangular and segmented arch pediments to articulate the wall, to create a bit of aesthetic, as well as to for these arches. Something that's also important to understand is that the Romans usually covered a lot of the inside because they didn't like the way the exposed material looked, but most of that has been kind of deteriorated, so all of that is gone, but a lot of it was either covered with tile or other materials. So that's also what we're seeing might not have been exactly as how it was. So the aqueduct is one of the most amazing aqueducts. Is the Point du Gard, and it's in France, and it was made out of masonry, and this one is 882 feet over the river, and it carries the water 160 feet above the level of the river. Its design is really pretty straightforward. It has the two lowest arch levels, and which are 60 feet in diameter, and it has the uppermost arches, which are 20 foot on center. So so you can really see these the idea use of arches here. So maybe when you've seen this, you just think of a bridge or something else, but now that we're trying to understand these Roman the use of arches, you start seeing how they're really they're using them and to create long spans, but one of the big things is they have to have these thick walls, these thick sort of bases as the arch is landing. I added this circle just so that you can see that it is almost a perfect circle. The angle and the way that the shape would go, it was really a really perfect degree that they were really working on. And outside, you can see these little squares, these little stones that are coming out. And these stones were usually what they used for timber, or for when they would go back and do anything that needed to remodel or to work on it again. So it was sort of where they would place their scaffolding in a way. And so that's sort of what you see there. They would leave it on purpose so they can go back and work on that. But now it's still sort of there being used. And the aqueducts, what's important is that they brought all these water to the city. The Romans were so ingenious, and now they were able to bring water into the city, and we'll see how that really changes the city later on. And second of all, it also brought water out. It created this sort of sewer system, which was incredible at the time. And the third thing that they started doing was that they started draining these swamps. So by draining these swamps, they would really provide the city with a very eliminating a lot of bad odors and eliminating a lot of diseases that would come from those places. So they were really creating a community that now had access to water, to clean water, and had access to be able to take any disposed water, any of these things, such as with the sewer system. And one of the things that is interesting to know, maybe it's not so much architecture, but so you can understand the city, is they had these Roman toilets, which were very public, open space, and this is how they looked. It was this is kind of one of the first concepts or ideas of toilets that they were using, and despite they don't look maybe that interesting to you, or maybe that like I would never use those toilets, it was a revolutionary idea for them at that time. So we start understanding how the Romans are very, very ingenious. So again, what are the building materials? So there's three important elements that really made the Romans' architecture so successful. So the Romans, as I mentioned, they were really conquering everything, but as they were conquering, they were also building. As they were able to start really building very fast, very big, very strong. And so, and the reasons, it was due to three things. One, I mentioned already, which was the arch and this true arch, which used with the keystone that was Vars, and these big piers. And the second was the Vera vaults, which they were able to, which is the same idea of the arch, but now just kind of elongated and pushed, down in a bigger scale. But the last thing is the concrete, which was created with layers of pozzolana and cement and a variety of stone and gravel. So this cement was derived from volcanic deposits, first discovered around what is called Fossoli, and so they named this pozzolana. Vitruvius, going back to Vitruvius, he called it a kind of natural powder, which from natural causes produces astonishing results. What the Romans were really discovering was this, that when they mixed this with lime, rubble, and water, the mixture was reacting in such a chemically way that it would harden as a stone, and it was even if it was water resistant. So through combining lime mortar, they were able to create these very bonding strength. They were able to have very strong material. So then they started really exploring with this, and they really started exploring with this new material, which really exploded their architecture idea. So because now the Roman was able to now the Romans were able to move this material very easily. As I mentioned, they just combine it with water, with some stones, with gravel. Here you can see another image, and so another ways of how they were constructing. But now it was this material that was very easily moved, that they can create. They can use the local things, but they can create very strong, firm foundations, very firm buildings. And so that's what really allowed them to, as I mentioned, explode in their architectural designs and be able to build wherever they went, and in such a massive scale. So these three things, the arch, the vault, and the concrete, was what really gave the Romans their new level of power, architecturally speaking. So now let's go let's go into understanding a bit more of the city. And so this is a Roman plan, a very similar plan that they used for their military camp, which is called the Castra. And located at the main north, so this is sort of important to know, good to understand how they organize the city. But going from north to south, they have what is called the Cardo, and from the east to the west, they have what the Decumanos. Sorry, my line went a little not straight. But you can start seeing how they're starting to organize their city. And the Cardo is a way that I like to remember it is Cardo rhymes or starts with the letter C, so it's where all the commerce was. So this is kind of in the street. That's where it was more based upon commons. And the commoners, there's no way to really remember this because there's no idiom that I can use, but it was where the very important structures were. So find a word like rhymes with the letter D, let me know. So in this street, it was sort of the important, and also this sort of cross shape becomes very important to them, as you see later on. They use this for the crucifixion. So this cross symbol sort of plays a role in Roman architecture. So we start seeing city planning, and I won't take too long in this image, because what I want to highlight the most is that in this plan, you start seeing all of the different things that we'll talk about later on. You start seeing the basilica here, you see a temple here, you start seeing the images are pretty small, so some things I cannot see, but I know there is a Triumphal Arch over here. You start seeing all these different things just really happening throughout the place. You see another temple over here. You see office spaces. You see a market, a vegetable market over here, and a temple. So you start seeing all these things, meat market. And so one of the things that they had is that they had their own symmetry. And so what does this mean? This means that here, you get the plan, there is some sort of, that line was horrible, but there is some sort of symmetry going on. And the same thing going on here. There's some sort of symmetry, but there's not an overall symmetry. There's not something that they all follow, but they do individually. Once they get into each temple and area, each basilica, they start following their own symmetry. This is very interesting because we just came from the Japanese architecture, which the whole city sort of had, and the Chinese sort of had this whole symmetry. The whole plan, the whole city plan had to have symmetry, but here the Romans are a bit more, free flow, just focusing more individually rather than collectively. So it's something interesting that we start seeing. And so we're going to go through a couple of the things that we saw in the city plan. The first one would be the Triumphal Arch. And so this one's the Arch of the Constantine, and Constantine is, this is a triple arch that later became a motive adapted to later building. And something to understand about here is, again, the Romans are bringing things from the Greek, are bringing things from what they've seen, and they're adapting and then they're using it basically because they can. And so here you start seeing these columns that sort of in a way not freestanding, but they're not structural at all. Like you know that this building, without them, this building or the structure will still stand. But they're using them in a very aesthetic, you know, showing sort of dominance, showing that they have adopted these styles. And so here you're seeing this again, use of the arches, the use of the big arches, and you're seeing how thick these walls are, this vault, this vault, as it creates this thing. And so the Triumphal Arch was basically, as it sounds, is to commemorate the victory of a battle, to commemorate the victory of, you know, as they conquered someone, or they just won a big war or something. And so, and usually in the top, you know, they start depicting the story of what happened, what they did, and all these different stories. And they're saying, who's it for? So having a Triumphal Arch was pretty a big deal. There were several, some were bigger than others. This one is right near the Colosseum. So the Colosseum is, it's facing this way. I remember, walking from here, and it's an amazing, you know, seeing this and the Colosseum very close together. So you'll see a lot of those. Then we started going into temples, and this is an early example of a Roman temple, but uses here you see that they're using the Ionic order here, as you know, you sort of seen in the Greek temples, but the building was orientated into an axis that is in the manner of the Etruscans. So they're not really placing this in the sense of such as the Greeks would have placed it. The Greeks really cared, so the Greeks, if we do comparison, the Greeks cared more about nature, connecting it to the nature, and while the Romans were more urban, but they connected it more inside of the city, not really connecting it to the nature itself. And again, we see this sort of idea of the cella, the porch, the raised stylobate, but again, you see this sort of front face. You see that it's on the side. You see these columns that again are simply, the wall is what's holding everything in, but the columns become more ornamental, and so it has this front face, very different to what we've seen with the Greek architecture. But we're talking about the temples. One of the most important temple that radically changes everything for architecture is the Pantheon. The Pantheon is one of the most, if not the most iconic architecture pieces, because of the dome that we'll see in a little bit, but it really has influenced so many different architects. So this is the front view that you start seeing, and again, I'll show you a little bit of picture. So this statue that you see here in the front, this fountain. Me and some friends, as we were there, we took a picture in that fountain. And I'm right here, you know, looking at, I don't know my face, or what am I asking? And I'm sort of, you know, just wondering what's going on with this picture. But let's keep going. So yeah, in the Pantheon, you can start seeing, this is a plan and some sections of the Pantheon. But it's a very interesting temple. So the Pantheon means, Pan means for all. So it's and God, and Theon means God. So it's a temple for all the gods. So that's very different to what we've seen before, because before it was the temple of Athena, or the temple of one god, maybe two gods at the most. But when you're designing a temple for all the gods, then it sort of changes the idea or the way they're going to design. So one of the things that they started doing, this design was commissioned by Hadrian. So I think you can see his name, Marcus Agrippa. I know it's not there, but this design was commissioned by Hadrian, and Hadrian was a lover of architecture. He loved architecture, and almost like Thomas Jefferson did, and so he commissions this design, and there's a lot to really study about this design. So stay here a little bit just because I really enjoyed this one. But one of the things that you start seeing, one is the idea of what is called Poche. And Poche means it means pocket. So what the Romans are saying, or what we learned through the Poche idea, is that plans should not look like this. This is not a plan of a house, a single line, but it should have some sort of depth. And through the depth, you see the black. It's sort of saying that it's a filled. Whenever you see a plan with black, it's saying that it's solid. So you're cutting through stone in a way. So what the Romans are saying, or they're doing through this Poche, which becomes something that is still used and said in architecture nowadays, is that walls have this big thickness. And so you start seeing it here. You start seeing the massing. You start seeing this Poche, really taking a big center. And so one of the things is that in order to bring a dome this big, it was a big engineering feat for the time, and even till now, it's one of the biggest that's ever done the way that this one has been done. And so the way that they had to do it is, again, the weight goes down, but it's also trying to push out. So the way they did it is that they started building very heavy in the bottom, and as they started going up slowly, the material started getting lighter. So we talked about pozzolana, we talked about cement, and the way cement is created is that there's some sort of stop of aggregates. So in order to create cement, they start adding some sort of stone, some sort of rock, and so they start changing the aggregates in order to make it not as heavy and not as strong, but also most importantly not as heavy. So they use the heaviest material for the bottom. I'm pretty sure you guessed that, and they start creating this lighter material, which is still concrete, still the same material, but they start creating it lighter and lighter as they start going up, and they start creating it lighter and lighter as they go up, and eventually they add this oculus right at the center, which is basically this open circle to the heavens, and now light can come in. So this is where the light comes in, but also water. There is some sort of drainage at the bottom, but they've created this circle, and you might think that maybe the circle is going to take away from the stroke, but in reality it really is helping, because now it's even lighter on the top. Another thing that they did to make it lighter was also they added this coffers, and I don't think there's an image. I should have had an image from the inside. But if you want to just Google this coffers, where there's this squares that start sort of going into recesses inside, and what this does, it does again reduce the weight. It starts removing some of it, but it doesn't lose its integrity. What's really, really amazing, it doesn't lose, because now it just becomes some sort of like corrugated, the way you see like corrugated cardboard that has all these little indentures and makes the cardboard stronger. That's sort of what these coffers are doing. So instead of really making it weaker structurally, it's getting even stronger. So it's really it's doing these different things in order to achieve this height and this width, and to creating this radius. Another thing that they do is that you start seeing that now they have this huge, this thick wall. And so, you know, in a way they could have just keep this wall, you know, just uh, completely full. But what they start doing is they start adding this niches and this sort of, you know, this breaks here inside. You see this niches, this sort of arches inside. And so what does that mean? So remember, this was Pantheon, so it was for many gods. So now they needed all these different altars for different gods. So now they could put all their different gods in different and all these different niches. So again, they're doing this one because they had the thickness, so they're like, what can we do with this thickness? And they started getting creative. But second, to combine it with the purpose of the building. And third, it also helps structurally. You might think that as they remove things, it started making it weaker, but it's actually also helping and make stronger, because now you had other arches that were sort of helping with the massing of the big dome on top. So another thing that I want to talk about is that you see that there's almost this perfect, or there is this perfect sphere. So not only is there not only that they created perfectly here, but you can see that there's this circle. So what does this mean? There's this idea that they got again from the Greek, specifically Plato, and that Plato was saying that the circle means the cosmos. So the circle symbolizes heaven, symbolizes, you know, the greater idea of heaven, and the square symbolize Earth. So what they were trying to do here is combining the idea of the cosmos, of the heavens, and also trying to capture Earth. So basically they were saying heaven and Earth merging into one, which is an amazing idea. And also as they kept this oculus, this open eye sort of to the sky, the eye means big eye, you as you are here, standing here, and you look up, this coffers, they start really make you feel as the dome is even higher than that they are. And so you're standing right at the center, and you're looking up, you see all these altars, you see this coffer, that kind of makes you feel like it's endless, and is connecting you to the cosmos, connecting you to the heavens, to the God. So there's this experience, this religious experience that is completely kind of takes you out of this world, which was the focus of this design. And as I mentioned, I was there, and I got the opportunity to stand there, right under there, and just look up, and the acoustics are amazing. It's really an experience out of this world. So if you really ever go, stand right at the center, look there, and just take it all in, and it's a really amazing experience. The last thing that I want us to look is, again, we've talked about temples, and temples have to have 4 things. What are those 4 things? You know, the cella, so the sort of the interior. So now we're just seeing here, we have the cella, we have the porch, sort of, and, you know, but still it has a sort of, not that the pediment, the stalobate, as much as the other, and the columns, you do sort of have them, but they're not really freestanding. So they're starting to make some ideas. And so this temple that you see in the front, here you see this square, that's sort of what we've been used to through the Greek. And the circle, there's also been some examples of that we didn't cover in class, but there is some temples that are circle, which such as the one in Tivoli. And here there's this sort of middle piece that is combining. So the Pantheon is sort of this porch entrance, this sort of bridge that you see it here sort of sticking out. It's not even the same place, and then a circle. So they're sort of combining. Again, the Romans were combining all these, creating this synthesis of all these different ideas and to create something completely new and completely different. So even nowadays, like I mentioned, the Pantheon has been an example to everyone. Every single dome that you see from here on sort of is referencing the Pantheon. And until to the architecture in Florence, this was the biggest one until we get to eventually Florence, and they do a bigger one. So now let's go through to the Basilica. Oh, let me do one last thing before I forget. When I was here, quick story for extra credit, if you're listening, I was standing actually here. There's a column here. You can see this column. And I was just sitting there drawing. And so as I was drawing, I was there for like a long time, 3, 4, 5 hours. I don't remember, but I was there for a long time, just sitting down, drawing, taking it all in. And for some reason, people started passing by, and for some reason thought I was like, I guess, doing it as a show, or I don't know exactly what they thought, but they started giving me money. And so after a while, I sort of just made it a mission to see how much money I would collect. And I think I put like a little cup or a hat or something. I don't remember what I put, but it was a book. I don't know. But I remember I started collecting money so that people can, and I didn't collect much. I think I bought like gelato with this on my screen. But for extra credit, what was I doing? That the question would be, what was I doing that they started giving me money? So, and the answer would be, I was drawing in front of the Pantheon, sorry. So there you go, you get an extra credit for the midterm. So now let's go into Basilicas. And so Basilicas, I won't talk too much about them right now because of time, but you start seeing how they start using the groin vaults, and they start really building this really tall meetings, it's conversations. It was the Basilica basically just means a meeting place, a place where they can have conversations. So, and later on, we're going to see how the Basilica, we're going to see the Basilica that, you know, maybe you think about it as a church. And then the Archbishop, there's the Basilica of San Juan. So we start seeing the Basilica because that's where it comes from, a meeting place, a place of gathering. And so, but there's a lot of things that sort of start coming out later on, which is the light which has come up from the top, which was the clerestory. And so here you start seeing the vaults sort of happening on the top. You start seeing the arches. And we'll get back to the idea of basilicas, but just want you to sort of know what were they for. And so this is sort of a plan of one of the bats. So again, we talked about water and how water was brought into the city, and this revolutionized the way the city worked. Now they had water that they could use for many things, and one of the things that they used it for was public baths. And public bath was basically this experience that they can, they had all these, they could now had a place for exercising, for athletic games, for walks. The main primary thing that they used it for was for hygiene, to be able to be clean, but you know, it really also provided them with a place for exercise, relaxation, a very social place where people can really interact. It was sort of like a modern health club, a country club, or a spa, you know. So even though it says public bath, just think of it more of as a country club, honestly. But again, I won't take too much time on this one, even though it's a really interesting. You're seeing the plan, you see the sort of axis, the sort of symmetry going on, which again, it didn't have an overall symmetry, but it did have a symmetry individually. But you start seeing the different areas that they had. They had hot water, they had open areas for exercise, the gym, and they went through the stages of cold, hot, had saunas, and it's really interesting to see how they were able to manage. Maybe you're asking, how did they get hot water and jacuzzis? And it's interesting, if you sort of go and see how they were able to get the fire on top, and it was really interesting how they engineered all of this. And right here, this is something that now it's what's surviving from this bath, this Roman bath, but now has converted into a church called Santa Maria degli Angeli, and it's but you can see how this was very, very high piece. We see this vaults again. Maybe haven't shown the vaults. See this arch. We start seeing this vaults again, going vaults, creating these pendentives, but maybe you never imagined that this was the bath right here. So this was one of the tallest, where there used to be the cool bath. So so you see they had this high place that is now remaining. So imagine this was your bath area. It is a pretty cool experience. Now we go to theaters and amphitheaters. So we've seen theaters in the Greek. The Greeks were doing the Greeks had already been perfected in a way by the Greeks. But the main difference is that the Greeks really were using the landscape. They were really, if you go back to looking at the Greek theaters, they were really making you like sit on this hill, and basically the whole outside was part of the scenery, was part of the theater experience. But again, the Romans, since they had a lot, now they had this material that they can basically use anywhere. They started using it as much as they could, basically. And so instead of using a hillside, they created more vaulted structures of stone and concrete. So they didn't care too much about the view. It wasn't about connecting it to nature. And I was going to include a picture of a Greek versus a Roman, but if you can do that on your own, it would be helpful for yourself. But then later on, the Romans started working on something different. Again, the Romans, they learned a lot from the Greek and Etruscan and all these different cultures, but they started really synthesizing and creating their own version. And one of the things that they started modifying and playing with was the amphitheater that we see here on the right. And the amphitheater, the word amphi means both sides. So basically a theater on both sides. So instead of creating this semicircle, this half circle, now you in a way you cut it into two, and now you have two theaters. So you create an amphitheater that was usually oval, circular, and they were, in order to have these gladiator contests, or they started creating this used it more as an arena to create this sort of games for the people to enjoy. And one of these places was the Circus Maximus, which was even one of the biggest. Now it doesn't exist anymore, but it's just basically the site is here, and you just sort of see it, and you just see the dirt around it. But this is again me. On every picture I show up like I'm lost or something. But this is me taking the subway. Either I don't know if I was just got out of the Circus Maximum or I was heading towards it. I don't remember. But this was me, and I don't know what this picture is going on. But that Circus Maximum, I didn't have a picture, but I just wanted to know that it's still there as one of them. And I remember just running around it and knowing that other people had run in there and played there and done all these things. It was interesting to see. On the left is one of my pictures that I took. I was actually going to ask you which picture do you think I took, but obviously the left one. The right one, it must have been a drone or helicopter. And here you see the arch that I was talking about earlier. So So you can see the Constantine Arch, really facing here. And so this, the amphitheater, one of the biggest amphitheaters is the Colosseum. And I think it also was called the Flavian Theater, Amphitheater, but now it's called the Colosseum. One of the reasons why people think it was, even though it was called the Flavian Theater, but we now call it the Colosseum, it was because it's believed that there was this great statue called Colosso, and colossal meaning huge, big, and it's sort of all been burned down and destroyed through the fire that eventually happened through Nero's time. But now eventually the name just sort of stuck because it was near the Colosso, so it became the Colosseum. So that's one of the theories or the stories of the set. So this is a very familiar oval shape that we saw with the amphitheaters, and it sort of seats about 50,000 people. So it was again huge, huge design that they were able to build. And one of the things that we talked about earlier, I don't think we can see very clearly here, but they use the Roman, the Doric, and the Ionic orders in their facade, not for structure, just because they can, just because they want to incorporate it into the architecture and saying, we're able to do it as well, and we're able to do it even bigger and massive. So Roman architecture was all about how big they could do, and it was basically because of this material and this arches and this engineering, and that they were exploding to see how big they could get. So this kind of takes me to this idea of massing and monumental. So even though these are just this, images or black silhouettes, I want you to think them as something that has weight. When we say massing in architecture, massing means something that has mass, something that has weight. So when we tell you, when an architect creates, one of the first things that they do when they start designing is that they start doing a massing model. So a massing model is basically, it doesn't have a very specific shape, does not have rooms, here's the restroom, here's the entrance, it has nothing of that. It just has the shape, it just has the weight, and it sort of helps the architecture understand the overall shape of where this design is going to go. So right now, if you're thinking of massing, what from the history, from the architecture that we've seen so far, what do these images make you think of? What do these images make you imagine? So Le Corbusier, which is a very, very important and famous architect, he travels to Rome and he starts understanding and seeing and saying, hey, these shapes are basically just massing. They're huge monumental architecture. So maybe, hopefully you saw this. Hopefully you saw, the pyramid, which was, again, a tomb, was used for something. But again, it just seems like this huge massing. And we've seen the Arch of the Triumph, which, again, it was used to commemorate victories, but it's a huge piece of massing. And then we get to the Colosseum, which is a circular thing, and it's again this idea of massing. So start thinking of those things as you start seeing architecture and how you can connect all these things. We're almost done. Let's keep going with as we keep going with the Romans. Now let's start understanding their residences. Here we start going into a courtyard, and a courtyard house which is called an atrium house. So the atrium, you see it here, and in the center, which is the same thing as you see here, and it's this open again area to the sky, and it's usually sort of the meeting place. It's usually the place that a very important place of meeting. So that's why everything sort of revolves. Everything sort of revolves around the atrium. So the atrium becomes something of a lot of importance. And so this plan is organized around a central open space that admitted fresh air and light into surrounding rooms. A portico or porch at the rear end that opened into a small garden. So you see the portico opening to the small garden. Position between these two elements was the tibium of main reception room. So here was, the sort of main reception room that you can see here to the right. So you start seeing this waiting room. And so you start seeing organizing of how this room is very organized. So this is a Roman house, or also called a domos. So when you think of Roman house, think of a domos. And this plan is also sometimes called like a fried egg scheme. So hopefully, maybe you like fried egg, or maybe you like them, you don't. But this is sort of how fried egg looks when it's being, cooked. And so the reason why some people call it the fried egg scheme is because it has this courtyard. So this courtyard is sort of, like the yolk here. And then everything else just sort of, there's nothing very clear. Here you see like this one's pretty clean, pretty well. But sometimes you see, an egg just sort of doing its own thing, depends on how it lands on the pan. So there's nothing very clear. There's not a specific orientation of the walls, or very of the outer perimeter walls. Sometimes it will be more rectilinear, sometimes it will be more, creating all these different shapes. And the reason why is because maybe there's another domus here and it's already built like this, so everyone else has to sort of follow this pattern. And the reason I included this image of two yolks is because sometimes it does happen. Sometimes there's an egg with two yolks, or sometimes, or you can even just combine two. So some houses do have two atriums, so that's something to be considering. But the atrium houses really have this big, it's a very clear organizational pattern. So if you're studying architecture, you eventually want to study architecture. Most likely you'll eventually do a design where you have the courtyard, because it's a very easy technique to design a house. It's a very clear, easy to way of created the design. So here you have your two sides, the antica and the postica, so the front, the back, and again, colina, you have the kitchen, so etc., where people can sit down. And so you start seeing all the vestibulum, which was the vestibule, which is where we get the word vestibule. And so you start seeing this sort of axis again happening. This one is a bit more, we're going back to the yolk. It's the yolk came out like this, but again, sometimes they do come out a lot different. But this was typical Roman house for the rich. So yes, we're talking about Roman houses, Roman domos, but it was usually for people who had money. And I talked about 2 atriums, 3 atriums, and if that happened, you really knew they had a lot of money. Usually people did not, usually, the common rich people have one, and as it went up, it had more atriums. So think of domos, it's a very nice house with all these different things, but it was for the, rich people. We go into the insula, which was more for the plebeians. So in the Roman times, there was 2 people, which was the patricians, which were rich sort of people, and it was the plebe, and which is a word for common people. So in the plebe, the way that they did this, it was most of the urban population actually lived in a building, something like this, that it did have some sort of cooking facilities. But they were actually on the top, so in order to minimize, the odor and the smell, and also the possibility of fire. And and the water had to be carried by public supply. So something that's very interesting to see in the previous one is that it usually had its own bath. It had its own water and restroom. They're private. Here you cannot, I couldn't see it, but I think here you could see it. No, it's not in this one either. But usually they did have some sort of private way, or depending on how rich they were. But what usually would happen here, so instantly I just want you to think of it as apartments. It was usually a 2-3 story, 4-story, 5-story something apartments. The rooms were pretty small. They were all sort of cramped up there. And you start seeing this, they were all sort of living there. In the bottom, it was usually shops. You start seeing that it was shop. There was a local arcade to walk around in shops. And so, and as they started going up, you know, there was also expensive rooms and less expensive. The higher you went, it was less expensive, and the smaller it was. And another thing is that next to them, usually that's where there was some sort of public bath for everyone, and so they had to leave in order to use the facility outside. So all of these are very deteriorated now. They did, you know, get consumed by fire. A lot of things sort of destroyed. They were not really being taken care of. So this is in reality how most of the Roman people lived. The domos and the others that we'll see right now were not too common. The villas is the last one that we talked about, that we'll talk about. In the villas, it was if you were really, 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 really rich. And so it's just a luxurious retreat that was usually either in the country or at the seashore. And this is Hadrian's villa. We talked about Hadrian, and Hadrian was the one that commissioned the Pantheon, and not only that, but he loved architecture. So you're going to see that in this great villa. This is sort of an aerial view of how it looks. But again, in this huge thing, there's so much that we can study about. But I just want you to understand the overall concept of it, understand the overall concept. He had a Roman bath. It started on a very high ground. He was very eclectic, meaning he was combining everything to create a new design. And he was very playful with the elements, you know, not just really trying to follow. As I mentioned, he really enjoyed architecture. So it seemed as in this became its playground for architecture, trying different things, combining different things. So it is a great piece of architecture to study. So one of the things that I wanted to show you all, that as we've seen, I don't know if you recognize this. Do you remember this was something that we've seen this before? So this was the caryatides that we've seen in Greek that were standing and in the temple outside, which are these like woman statues, sort of, you know, that are sort of columns. They're used as columns, and they're more freestanding. So it's interesting to see Roman using this in a villa just for, in a way, decoration. And so again, we go back to the idea of understanding what Romans were doing, and so that kind of brings us to our conclusion that, you know, the Romans were the first people to really build large interior spaces due to the fact of the art of masonry and vaulting, brick, stone, through their new material that was through the new ingredient as porcelain, so using this concrete, this brick, and so and as they created new towns, they were adding all these. They were following this layout, this squared layout, this cross layered, and they started building public spaces such as temples, basilicas, baths, theaters, amphitheaters. And such as in an example would be Timgad that I didn't include a picture, but you can look into that later on. And so the Romans just simply synthesized and expanded and created a whole new level of architecture that that was really, really important. So now I'm gonna do a little quick review of some questions that, again, if you kind of go over this review, it will help you for the quiz. So I recommend that you do listen to these reviews. So it will be a review for the midterm, and I already went over some questions about Chinese and Japanese. So these will be just questions about this chapter. So I'm gonna share the book. As you can see here, this is where I've created things, and so now let me start. So I think, yeah, this is Cloaca. So what is the Cloaca Maxima? I didn't mention it too much. This, you do have to read the book in order to. I mentioned other versions of this, but I didn't mention this version. But what is the Cloaca Maxima? It's a sewer system in Rome. So this was, I didn't mention it, but the Etruscans actually were the ones that actually started this, and the Romans sort of continued it in the Cloaca Maxima. It's still being used till nowadays, and it's really amazing how they managed to do this. So Cloaca Maxima is a sewer system in Rome. Identify this building. What is this? I said that we'll talk about this later on. But what was it? The Roman baths are nearby. This is a nice Basilica, and it's actually Basilica Nova and Rome. Just the date. So what is a villa? Remember, it was a domos, insulae, and villa. So what is a villa? It's for the riches, and so it's a country house built for the upper class in the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire. Roman city that was destroyed. Oh, I didn't talk about this because this was definitely in the book, but it's important. So this class has to do with. I did have some plans of those, but I think I just completely jumped over it. But when we talk about Roman cities, we do need to talk about Pompeii. In Pompeii, I'm pretty sure you've heard of it, and if you haven't heard of it, it's a city that was near this volcano called Mount Vesuvius. And the story, you know, there's a video there's a link provided in one of the lectures here that it shows you a time lapse of what it could have looked that day when the volcano erupted, and you start seeing the city covered in ashes. And so it completely erupted and covered the whole city. And nowadays, after several years, it was sort of lost, but now it's been sort of recovered, and you see a lot of things have remained sort of frozen in time. So they found bodies, they found things of they sort of mummified in a way as this volcanic ashes really turned them into basically stone almost instantly. And so I was also a little tour tip, I guess, helping you all if you ever do travel. This city is really small, but Pompeii is an amazing city. It is an amazing experience to see Pompeii, but the city itself is pretty small. So you need to get a train, and in order to get there, what I'm saying is I don't recommend you planning a trip of 2 or 3 days there. In order to just be there one day and then leave the next day, because being there multiple days, you really will not, you will be pretty bored the next day because you kind of get to see all of Pompeii in one day. So that's a little tour, a little insight for that. Because I remember I did stay a couple of days, and we were like, okay, what do we do now? So Roman city that was destroyed, and this was Pompeii. Coffers, we talked about them. They were in the Pantheon, and the recesses found in the domes in order to make the structure lighter, like the dome in the Pantheon. But Triumphal Arches, we talked about these. Freestanding monuments built to commemorate a military victory. So we just talked about this. So what is this image? This is actually the Arch of Constantine, and I mentioned it was very near the Colosseum. What is a civic center and focuses on public life of Roman cities? I didn't talk about this one actually. It's in the book. It's part of the city. Didn't talk about it, but I guess the definition is here. So, the civic center that focuses on public life in Roman cities, and it's called a forum. So, it is an important piece of architecture. So, read about it. It will be in the test, even though I didn't cover it too much. But it's very similar to Basilica, very similar to a temple. It combines different ideas of those, and so it just kind of creates this whole thing. So, I think, I don't know. Okay, this was from the Great Wall. Who was Augustus Caesar? This wasn't, I didn't mention him either too much. I did mention about the Roman sort of getting power and starting going into war, but it didn't mention him by name. So read about him. It's important that you know a little bit of the history. But Augustus Caesar was, to a certain point, when Christ eventually arose in the 1st century, it resulted in the assumption of dictatorial power by the military leader Julius Caesar. And dictatorial power in those days, they call them dictators, and dictators just simply means he who speaks, he who can speak. So it wasn't really too much of a dictatorship of all the power, but it was more of who had that he had the ability to speak and had the power. And he was assassinated. Maybe you know the story of Julius Caesar, where one of his closest friends called Brutus kills him, and he says the famous phrase "Et tu, Brutus," meaning also you, Brutus, because he knew everyone was going to betray him, but he never expected his best friend. So it's a story of understanding. So that phrase is that you can be betrayed even by closest friends, and so it's sort of a phrase that became very popular. So he's assassinated, and then he's ushered into the Roman Empire, and after that, the first emperor becomes Augustus Caesar in 27 BCE. Again, we talked about it very lightly, but it's important for you to know. Feng Shui, we talked about it, but that's for the other chapter. What material was used for the dome of the Pantheon? So we talked about the material over and over again, which is concrete, combined porcelain, and all these different aggregates. Remember how it got lighter as it went up. What was a basilica? I talked about it very shortly, but I mentioned that it was a large, long building with double colonnades and a semicircle apse used in ancient Rome as a court of law or for public assemblies. It was a place of gathering just to have these conversations. So what is this image? You don't have to give a specific name, but what is it? What is it for? And what is the type of architecture? And it's an amphitheater. Hygienic facilities. So that should be this one should be pretty simple. Provided exercise, relaxation, and foremost socializing activities. If you see an answer, country club, please don't answer that one. But it's the Roman baths, public baths. What ancient culture flourished in north central Italy, now known as Tuscany, and greatly influenced the Romans. We talked about them, that, even in the book has this title called Etruscan imprint, so the Etruscans. An apartment, multi-level block built for the lower class, so option A, domos, option B, villa, option C, insulae. What do you think it is? Insula. Okay, so the city was planned in this cross plan, and it has this four sort of cross plan, and it has this street that goes from north to south and this street that goes from east to west. So what are those streets called? You need to know those. And standard goods for new military garrisons and colonial cities. So Romans use standard grid for plans for new military garrisons. We'll talk about the streets later on. What structural method allowed the Romans to build structures with great spans? So what structural method? So we talked about if it would have been a structural material, it would have been concrete. But when we talk about a method, what is the method? It's the use of arches. Here we see the use of arches. We see the use of different sort of arches. But what is the even small arches on the top? But what is this called? This is an aqueduct called the Pont du Gard in Nimes in France. And so it is important you know which one is called. It's also that it's an aqueduct. So Roman aqueduct, what is it? What is it? Deliver water to cities and towns. So the original order was Ionic, Doric, and Corinthian, but the Romans added two more. In a way, the Romans added one, but I guess could see that it was two. So one, it was really more attributed to the Etruscans, which was the Tuscan. Very easy to remember, Tuscan. But the Romans, they added one themselves. Which one was it? And this was the composite combining, the value of the, what's it called, Ionic, combining it with the sort of leaf-like look of Corinthian. So remember, there was people. So if you were the rich, you were called patricians. But if you were the free, you are called landed. So the aristocracy were patricians, and the general class of free citizens were plebs. So the general class of free citizens, plebs. Porcelana, what is it? Hydraulic cement called porcelana allowed the Romans to create concrete. Which one is this? Remember, I was in the picture there. I was drawing in one of those columns, and I got given money during being at the Pantheon. So castra versus ducamus. We talked about this. That is in the plan. So which castra? What is it? Does it go north and south, or does it go east to west? So the Romans used military camps castra, and they lived the main north-south street Cardo, and the east-west roads Decimano. So remember these two, Cardo and Decimano. Cardo, remember, C, it was more commerce, so more stores, and the D, I started to find a word that rhymes with D, or goes with the letter D, but it was about important features. And yeah, I think that's sort of it, or sort of everything. So thank you so much for listening till the end. I appreciate it. Hopefully it was interesting for you all. Hopefully you're able to get out of this lecture, and hopefully you stay till the end and you're able to see some of the little review for the midterm. So this the midterm, it will be a combination of everything that we've seen up to this point. So I will be honest with you, most of the things will rely mostly on these two chapters, specifically this chapter. So because it's what you've seen the latest, so it probably more fresh in your mind. So so hopefully you are able to you'll do good with the test. Just review this chapter, but also, as I mentioned, it will cover all of the chapters. But hopefully the review with these two chapters will help you with the test. So thank you, and have a good day. Any questions, feel free to let me know.